Margaret Whittaker was 72, the night Daniel laughed at me across my own dining table. It was early October, I think. One of those damp Ohio evenings, when the windows fog slightly from the heat of the kitchen, and the whole house smells like roasted chicken, black pepper, and the last of the thyme from the garden. Laura had set out the blue stoneware plates I used to keep for Sundays. She always said they made dinner feel more proper somehow. That night they looked less like tradition and more like props in someone else's home. Daniel was sitting at the head of the table. That detail stayed with me longer than I expected. My husband, Thomas, had sat in that chair for 42 years. Not because he cared about ceremony. Thomas never cared much for ceremony. But it had simply become his place over time. The left arm of the chair still had a faint scratch where he used to tap his wedding ring when he read the evening mail. Even after he passed, I never brought myself to sit there. It felt wrong somehow. Daniel had started using that chair a few months after moving in, like a man trying on a coat that didn't quite belong to him but deciding to wear it anyway. I was sitting near the kitchen doorway. Easier for serving, Laura had explained when they first arrived. Temporary, she had said then. Temporary has a quiet way of unpacking all its boxes. Mason and Claire were at the table with their phones angled toward their plates. Laura looked tired in the particular way hospital shifts leave on a person dark circles under her eyes, hair tied back without much thought. Daniel, on the other hand, looked well rested. Comfortable. Very comfortable for a man eating dinner in a house he did not pay for. He was wearing one of those quarter-zip pullovers with a small stitched logo near the chest. Expensive brand. The sort of thing people buy when money feels easy. Whether he realized it or not, the money had once passed through my hands. I remember reaching for a second spoonful of potatoes. Not much, just enough to finish the meal properly. And that was when he said it. "Is this pathetic old woman really going to eat that much again?" He said it loudly, not as a mutter, not under his breath. He said it in a way that made sure the whole table heard it, and the whole table did. Mason gave a short laugh the awkward kind boys make when they're not sure if something is cruel or simply adult humor. Claire covered her mouth, but she was smiling too. Laura lowered her gaze to her plate. She didn't say anything. She just kept cutting her chicken into small, careful pieces. Daniel leaned back in his chair with a satisfied look, like he had delivered the line he had been waiting all evening to say. That's when the room went quiet. Not silent exactly. Silverware still moved. A chair creaked against the hardwood floor. Someone's phone vibrated softly against the table. But quiet in the way a room becomes quiet when respect leaves it all at once. I looked at Laura first. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because when something hurts, you check your own blood before you look at the stranger. She didn't look up. Daniel laughed again. I'm kidding, Margaret. Don't make that face. Then you'll complain later that your stomach hurts and everyone has to hear about it. There are moments when the body understands something before the mind is ready to name it. I felt that then. It wasn't anger. Anger is loud and hot. This felt colder, cleaner, like a door closing quietly somewhere inside me. I placed my fork on the plate, folded my napkin once, wiped my mouth, even though I had barely eaten enough to need it. "Excuse me," I said. No one stopped me. That may have been the worst part. I walked upstairs to the small back bedroom I had been using for nearly 5 years. It used to be my sewing room. The master bedroom. My bedroom was down the hall, now occupied by my daughter and her husband. For years I told myself the arrangement made sense. Easier for the children. Easier for Laura. Easier for everyone. Some people mistake silence for permission. I didn't say that out loud that night. I only thought it as I sat on the narrow bed beneath the slanted ceiling. Downstairs, the television turned on. Daniel's laugh carried faintly through the floor vent. A cabinet door opened and closed in the kitchen, life continuing as if nothing had happened. That's the strange thing about humiliation. It rarely announces itself as a dramatic event. Most of the time, it simply settles into the routine and waits to see if you will accept it. I leaned over and opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand. Inside sat an old metal cash box. It had once been painted green, though rust had begun to creep around the latch. I kept papers inside it that I had not reviewed carefully in years. Warranty slips, deed copies, church envelopes, and a folded card from the funeral home with Thomas's name written across it. Beneath those papers was a business card. Richard Hale, attorney at law. I hadn't called him since the probate work after Thomas passed. I held the card for a moment longer than necessary. Then I picked up my phone. It was around 8:40, I believe. Too late for a polite call, but not too late for a message. I stared at the screen for longer than I care to admit. Not because I was unsure what had happened. That part was perfectly clear. I was deciding between comfort and procedure. Comfort had kept me quiet for 5 years. Procedure might finally change something, so I typed 3 lines. Richard, this is Margaret Whitaker. I need to see you tomorrow morning if possible. It concerns my house, my accounts, and some old documents I should have reviewed sooner. I read the message twice before sending it. Then, once again after it went through. A moment later, the small delivered notice appeared on the screen. That was the first detail that would matter later. I had written my house, my accounts, my documents. Not our house, not family accounts, mine. I washed my face, changed into my nightgown, and sat back on the edge of the bed. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Usually after something upsetting, my hands shake when I button sleeves or open pill bottles. Not that night. That night everything felt precise. Downstairs, someone opened the dishwasher. Footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. The house slowly settled into its normal nighttime sounds. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. Daniel had made one mistake too many. Not the insult itself, though it was ugly enough. The mistake was assuming there would be no structure behind me. No records, no paper, no line. He couldn't talk his way around. He wasn't expecting that answer, even though he hadn't heard it yet. At 9:07, my phone lit up again. Richard's reply. Be here at 9:30. Bring whatever you have. If possible, do not discuss this with anyone tonight. I read the message 3 times. Then I placed the phone face down on the quilt Thomas's sister had sewn for us in 1988, and exhaled slowly. That's when everything changed. Not because anyone apologized. Not because the family suddenly understood what they had done. Nothing downstairs had changed at all. The shift happened because I chose a file over a fight. And once I made that choice, I slept better than I had in years. I woke up before the alarm the next morning. That used to happen when Thomas had early site inspections. His company built small municipal bridges and drainage culverts across central Ohio, and he liked to leave before the morning traffic began. I would hear the coffee grinder around 5:30, smell the dark roast drifting through the hallway, and follow him downstairs a few minutes later. That memory came back to me as I sat up in the narrow sewing room bed. For a moment, I forgot where I was sleeping. Then the slanted ceiling reminded me. I checked the time on my phone. 5:42 a.m. The house was quiet, except for the refrigerator, humming faintly downstairs. I dressed slowly grey slacks, a white blouse, and the navy cardigan I used to wear for church committee meetings. Nothing dramatic. I had no interest in looking like someone preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing for documentation. Before going downstairs, I opened the green metal box again. Inside were copies of deeds, tax statements, and investment summaries. I hadn't reviewed them carefully since Thomas passed. At the time, grief made every administrative detail feel unbearable. Laura had offered to handle the paperwork, and back then it had felt like kindness. Later I realized it had also been convenience. I spread the documents across the bed, house deed Margaret Whitaker, sole owner. 2 commercial storefront leases downtown, both in my name. Investment account just under $140,000 the last time I had looked. And then there was the document that took me a moment longer to recognize. The loan guarantee. 2 years earlier, Daniel had asked me to co-sign a business loan for his auto repair shop. $80,000, he said. Temporary support. Just paperwork, Margaret. At the time, I believed him. I folded the document carefully and placed it in my bag. That was the first evidence action, though I didn't think of it that way then. The second happened quietly. At 6:10, I opened my laptop and logged into the account Laura had been managing for what she called household expenses. The page loaded slowly, like it always did. But when the transactions appeared, I noticed something I hadn't paid proper attention to before. Repeated withdrawals. Large ones. Restaurant charges. Travel bookings. Electronics stores. One entry stopped me. $32,480 vehicle purchase. I didn't recognize the date, but I recognized the number. Daniel's car. I leaned closer to the screen and scrolled through the statements more carefully. Something about the pattern felt wrong. Not just 1 or 2 expenses. A steady stream. I exported the last 2 years of transactions, saved them to a flash drive, printed the summary pages. That made 2 evidence actions in a row. The pressure beat came about 10 minutes later. Footsteps overhead. Daniel waking up. I closed the laptop. The house smelled like cold coffee and laundry detergent when I walked into the kitchen. Daniel was already at the table eating scrambled eggs from a pan he had apparently decided not to wash afterward. "Morning," I said. He barely looked up. "Coffee's on the stove." It was lukewarm. Laura came downstairs a few minutes later in her nurse's uniform, tying her hair into a loose ponytail. She looked at me briefly, with that distracted expression people wear when they know something uncomfortable happened the night before, but are hoping it will quietly disappear if nobody mentions it. "Mom, you're up early." "I have an appointment downtown." Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Appointment?" "Just paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" His tone had a slight edge to it, the kind that pretends to be casual while quietly checking for danger. I smiled. "Old documents. Nothing interesting." He studied me for a moment longer than usual. Then he shrugged. "All right." At the time, I didn't think much of that exchange. Later, I realized Daniel had already started calculating. I left the house at 8:50. The air outside carried that thin October chill that sits just above the skin. My neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, was watering her flowers along the sidewalk. She waved when she saw me. "Morning, Margaret. Want some tomatoes later?" "Maybe," I said. That small moment mattered more than I understood at the time. Because social pressure rarely starts with big confrontations. Sometimes it begins with neighbors noticing ordinary routines. The law office sat on the 4th floor of an old brick building downtown. The elevator rattled the same way it always had. I noticed the brass directory board had been updated since my last visit. Richard Hale had aged too, more grey around his temples. When I stepped into his office, he looked up from a folder and paused for a second. "Margaret," he said slowly. "You look different." "I probably do." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Let's start from the beginning." So I did. I told him about the dinner, the comment, the laughter. But mostly, I told him about the finances, the rents, the loan guarantee, the account withdrawals. When I finished, Richard clasped his hands together and nodded once. "Before we talk about emotion," he said calmly, "we need to talk about structure." That sentence cooled the entire room. He opened a folder and slid 2 documents across the desk. "First," he said, "your daughter holds a limited power of attorney. Did you know that?" "Yes." "Did you realize it can be revoked immediately?" "No, that's option 1. He turned another page. Second, the loan guarantee you signed for Daniel's business can be withdrawn if misrepresentation occurred, which, based on these statements, he tapped the printed pages, appears possible. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, clarity. Richard, I asked quietly, what happens if I withdraw it? He looked up at me. The bank calls Daniel, and then? And then the responsibility becomes entirely his. I nodded slowly. That was the first partial explanation. Daniel's safety net had never been the business. It had been me. Richard leaned forward slightly. Margaret, once we file this, things will escalate. I assumed they would. He slid a pen toward me. Then let's start with procedure. My hand hovered above the paper for a moment, not because I was uncertain, because I realized something. For 5 years, I had tried to solve family problems with patience and silence. Now I was solving them with documentation. I signed. That was the institutional pivot. And at the time, I had no idea how quickly the consequences would arrive. Richard placed the signed document into a thin grey folder and wrote the date carefully across the top. October 14, he said quietly, almost to himself, the way people do when they are marking something official. Then he looked up at me again. There are 3 things that will happen now. His voice carried the same calm cadence I remembered from the probate meetings after Thomas passed. Richard had always spoken the way engineers write reports. Nothing rushed, nothing theatrical. Every sentence placed exactly where it belonged. First, he continued, tapping the page I had just signed, the power of attorney will be revoked and filed with the bank. Your daughter will no longer have access to your accounts. He slid another document toward me. Second, the loan guarantee will be withdrawn. The bank will notify Daniel within 48 hours. He paused briefly. Possibly sooner. And the third? I asked. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair. We begin documenting everything from this point forward. That sentence stayed with me longer than the others. Document everything. He reached for the bank statements I had printed earlier that morning. These withdrawals, he said, tapping a column with the tip of his pen, represent roughly $96,000 over 2 years. I blinked. I thought it was closer to 60. That's because the refinancing wasn't visible on the earlier summaries. He rotated the paper so I could see the full column more clearly. Loan refinance, loan extension, vehicle purchase, travel charge. Daniel's pattern became visible the moment someone showed me how to read the numbers properly. Quiet spending, regular withdrawals, nothing loud enough to trigger alarm all at once, just steady movement, like water finding a crack in a wall. It made sense, in a strange way. For most of my adult life, numbers had been my responsibility. I handled payroll and invoices for Thomas's company during the early years. I balanced accounts when the business was small enough that we couldn't afford a full-time accountant. Seeing the pattern now reminded me of another moment entirely. A memory surfaced without warning. It must have been 1981. Thomas and I were sitting at the tiny kitchen table in our first apartment. The table had a small burn mark on one corner from a soldering iron he had left there by accident. Outside the window, a freight train rattled slowly through the industrial district behind the building. Thomas pushed a stack of invoices toward me. I hate this part, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. You love the building, I replied. I do. Then let me handle the numbers. He looked relieved in a way that made me laugh. You sure? I picked up the calculator and tapped a few keys. Thomas, someone in this marriage has to stay organized. He grinned. Fair enough. The memory ended with the quiet clicking of calculator buttons. The pressure beat returned when Richard spoke again. Margaret, he said gently, there's another issue. What issue? He lifted a second document from the folder. The car. The Nissan? Yes. It was purchased using funds from your rental income account. I stared at the page. I didn't authorize that. No, Richard said evenly. You didn't. The office felt colder suddenly, though the thermostat hadn't changed. Legally, he continued, that purchase could be considered misappropriation of funds under a limited authority. Meaning? Meaning the asset may still belong to you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. That's when the room went quiet. Not dramatically. Just the kind of quiet that settles when a simple fact shifts the balance of a situation. You're telling me Daniel's car may technically be yours, Richard finished. I let out a slow breath. At the time, I didn't think much about the car itself. Later, I would realize that detail would become one of the pressure points, forcing everything else into the open. Richard continued reviewing the documents. Exported statements, loan balance updates, property deeds. That made 2 more evidence actions. Then came the pressure beat. Margaret, Richard said finally, closing the folder. Once the bank calls Daniel, he will likely confront you. I assumed that. People tend to react emotionally when financial structure changes. I don't intend to react. Emotionally. Richard nodded once. That's good. He folded his hands on the desk. Because procedure doesn't respond to emotion. That sentence stayed with me long after I left his office. Procedure doesn't respond to emotion. When I stepped outside, it was a little after 1:30. The sun had come out, warming the sidewalks just enough to soften the cold air. Downtown Columbus looked completely ordinary office workers carrying lunch bags, buses stopping every few blocks, someone walking a golden retriever near the courthouse steps. The world had no idea anything had shifted, and strangely, that felt reassuring. I walked 3 blocks before stopping at a small coffee shop I used to visit years ago. The interior looked almost exactly the same. Tall windows, wooden tables, the faint smell of espresso and cinnamon. I ordered a cappuccino and sat near the window. At the time, I didn't think much about the text message Richard sent while I was there. Bank notification sent. Expect contact soon. 3 short lines. That was all. But that message introduced a quiet curiosity loop. When exactly would Daniel find out? And how would he react? As it turned out, I didn't have to wait long. When I returned home around 4 that afternoon, Daniel was pacing in the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was louder than usual. What do you mean, revoked? He turned the moment he saw me standing in the doorway. His face changed color. Red first, then pale. Hold on, he said into the phone. He lowered it slowly. Margaret. I set my bag down on the table. Yes? Did you go to the bank today? No. Then how did they remove my guarantor? I met his eyes calmly. I spoke with my lawyer. That's when everything changed. Daniel stared at me as if he had misheard. Laura stepped out of the kitchen. What's going on? Daniel pointed toward me. Your mother just pulled out of the loan. Laura blinked. What loan? The shop loan. Her eyes moved to me. Mom? I revoked the guarantee. Silence. Not shouting. Not yet. Just confusion. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. You can't do that. Actually, I said quietly, I can. He laughed sharply. This is ridiculous. You signed the contract. I signed it based on information that turned out to be incomplete. What does that mean? It means the business closed months ago. Laura turned slowly toward him. Daniel? He avoided her eyes. Temporary issues. I opened my bag and placed the printed statements on the coffee table. I also reviewed the account withdrawals. Laura stepped closer. What withdrawals? Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Margaret, we don't need to do this right now. I looked at Laura. Do you know how much money left that account over the past 2 years? Her voice was small. No. Almost $100,000. That was the pressure beat. Laura sank slowly into the chair. Daniel's jaw tightened. Those were household expenses. No, I said evenly. Some were. Many weren't. I tapped one of the pages. The Cancun trip. Another. The electronics store. Another. The car. Laura looked up sharply. The car? Daniel muttered something under his breath. That's when the room went quiet. Because everyone finally understood something important. The paperwork already had my name on it. Daniel looked down at the papers on the coffee table as if they might rearrange themselves into a different story. They didn't. Laura picked up the first page. I watched her eyes move slowly across the transactions. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything. Then she spoke. Cancun? Her voice carried that thin disbelief people use when they're still hoping someone will interrupt and say there has been a mistake. Daniel rubbed his forehead. That was business travel. Laura lifted her head and looked at him. For a mechanic shop? He didn't answer. I didn't raise my voice. I had already learned something earlier that morning inside Richard's office. Procedure cools a room faster than anger ever can. I'm not discussing feelings today, I said quietly. I'm discussing structure. Daniel scoffed. Structure? Margaret, you're acting like this is some kind of courtroom. No, I replied calmly. If it were a courtroom, the numbers would already be entered into evidence. That line stayed in the air longer than I expected. Laura lowered the paper slowly. How much did the car cost? Daniel shifted his weight. 32. 32,000! Yes. And the account covered the down payment, he muttered. The silence stretched for a moment. That was the first financial lane escalation. Daniel's debt had just become visible, but the social lane appeared immediately afterward. From the hallway came the soft creak of the staircase. Mason. He had come halfway down the stairs without any of us noticing. Dad? He said quietly. Daniel turned sharply. Go back upstairs. Mason didn't move. Is Grandma mad at you? Laura stepped toward him. Sweetheart, this isn't... But Mason had already heard enough. Children understand tension long before they understand facts. That moment became the social pressure beat. Daniel straightened suddenly. This is ridiculous, he said, louder than before. You're embarrassing me in front of my own family. I tilted my head slightly. Daniel, this is my house. The emotional temperature shifted again. Not hotter, colder, because the word house carried a very different meaning now. Laura noticed it too. She looked at me carefully. You spoke to a lawyer? Yes. And the bank? They've already been notified. Daniel let out a harsh laugh. You're serious. I am. What exactly did you tell them? Only what the documents show. He ran both hands through his hair. This is unbelievable. At the time, I didn't think much of the way his voice changed there. Later, I recognized it as the moment when performance began turning into panic. Daniel walked toward the front window and stared outside. So what now? He asked after a moment. That depends on you. I reached into my bag again and removed a second envelope. Another evidence action. Inside were 2 printed pages Richard had prepared before I left his office. I placed them neatly on the coffee table. Daniel didn't touch them. Laura did. She read the first paragraph slowly. Her eyes widened. Mom, what is this? It's a proposal, Daniel turned. What proposal? Laura swallowed. 6 months. For what? To move. The room shifted again. Daniel stepped closer. You're kicking us out? No, I said. I'm giving you options. He grabbed the paper and scanned it quickly. Rent, $500 per month. Debt restructuring, $50,000 repayment plan. Mandatory family mediation. Financial separation. Daniel's mouth opened slightly. This is insane. Actually, I said calmly, it's generous. Laura kept reading. And if we don't agree? I answered that part. Then the legal process begins. Daniel looked up sharply. What legal process? The full loan liability. And the car? I met his eyes. The car may legally belong to me. That's when the room went quiet again. Because Daniel understood something important. You can't take what was never yours. He exhaled slowly. You're serious about this? I am. Laura sat down carefully. Her hands trembled a little as she placed the papers back on the table. Mum, why didn't you say something sooner? The question wasn't angry, just tired, and it opened another memory. A winter evening many years earlier, Thomas and I were standing in the garage while snow tapped softly against the metal door. Laura was about 10 years old then. She had come home upset after an argument at school. She said I was bossy. Laura told me angrily. Thomas knelt beside her. Being organized isn't bossy, he said. It's leadership. Laura crossed her arms. What if people don't like it? Thomas shrugged. Respect matters more than being liked. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and cold air. Laura nodded slowly. Okay. The memory faded. The pressure beat returned in the present. Laura looked at me now as if that same lesson had resurfaced in her mind. Mum, she said quietly. Yes? Are we really this far gone? I took a slow breath. We were already here. Daniel sat down heavily across from us. He looked again at the papers. You think I'm some kind of criminal? No, I said. I think you made a mistake. A mistake? Yes, he laughed bitterly. What mistake? You assumed silence meant approval. The sentence settled into the room like a small truth nobody could ignore. Some people mistake silence for permission. Daniel leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a moment. For the first time since the conversation started, he looked smaller. Laura spoke quietly. What happens now? The bank will restructure Daniel's loan. And the house? You can stay here for 6 months under the agreement. Daniel shook his head slowly. And after that, you'll move. The social lane escalated again. From upstairs, Claire's voice drifted down. Mum. Laura wiped her eyes quickly. Coming! She stood and paused beside me. Mum, did you already decide everything? No. What do you mean? You still have a choice. Daniel looked up. What choice? Whether this ends peacefully. He stared at the paper again, because now the structure was visible. 6 months, payments, rules, consequences. The financial lane had tightened. The social lane had exposed everything. And Daniel was beginning to understand something important. The system he had assumed was flexible had already been documented. Daniel didn't speak for a while after that. He just sat there looking at the papers as if they were written in a language he hadn't realized he would ever need to learn. Laura had gone upstairs to check on the kids. I could hear her voice faintly through the ceiling, vent steady, quiet, trying to sound normal. The house felt different already. Not louder, just clearer. Daniel finally leaned forward and picked up the second page. What does this line mean? He asked. Which one? He pointed to the middle paragraph. Account separation effective immediately. It means exactly what it says. You're freezing the household account? No. I'm removing my income from it. Daniel rubbed his jaw slowly. That's basically the same thing. No, I said quietly. It's structure. That was the next tightening in the financial lane. Rental income redirected. Access revoked. Authorization removed. Daniel exhaled slowly. And the bank? They'll call you again. They already did. I nodded. They asked for new collateral. And? Daniel gave a short laugh that didn't contain any humor. I don't have any. The emotional temperature shifted again. Performance had clearly moved into panic. He stood up and paced across the living room, stopping near the window before turning back toward me. You're putting me in a corner. No, I said calmly. I'm removing the cushion. That distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. Daniel stopped pacing. You know what happens if I default on that loan? Yes. They'll come after everything. Yes, he stared at me. You'd really do that to your daughter? That line hung in the air for a moment, but the answer came easily. I didn't create the debt. Daniel didn't respond, because that was the institutional truth. Laura came back downstairs then. Her eyes were slightly red, but her voice sounded steadier. The kids know something's wrong. Daniel looked away. Great. They're not stupid, she said quietly. Laura sat beside him and placed the papers neatly on the coffee table again. Daniel, we need to talk about this seriously. I am talking. No, she said gently. You're reacting. That was the social lane correcting itself, and it mattered. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. What exactly do you want me to say? Laura took a slow breath. I want you to admit what happened. Daniel looked down at the floor. That I screwed up? Yes. He nodded once. Fine. Laura turned toward me. And Mom, the therapy requirement. Yes? I think we should do it. Daniel looked up sharply. You're serious? Yes. He gave a nervous laugh. So now we're going to therapy because of accounting errors? Laura shook her head. No. Because of 5 years. The room cooled again. 5 years. That number settled quietly between us. Daniel leaned back in the chair. What if I agree to everything? Then the agreement stands. And the debt? 50,000. He exhaled slowly. That's still a lot. Yes, but it's not the full amount. No. He ran his hands through his hair again. What if I can't pay? That's why the car is listed as collateral. Daniel froze. You're serious about taking the car? I'm serious about recovering the money. That was the financial lane tightening again. Laura spoke softly. Daniel, the car was bought with Mum's money. He didn't answer, because that fact had already been documented. Then came the next quiet interruption. A phone call. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. He stared at it for a moment before answering. Hello? I could hear the faint voice from the other end. Bank compliance. Daniel's posture stiffened immediately. Yes, I understand. Pause. No. Margaret is no longer attached to the loan. Another pause. Yes. I'll need time to review my options. He ended the call slowly. That was the institutional tightening. Compliance notice. Official confirmation. Daniel looked back at me. They're giving me 30 days. That's standard. 30 days to restructure. Yes, he shook his head. This is insane. But his voice sounded different now, less angry, more tired. Laura reached for his hand. What are you thinking? Daniel stared at the documents again. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he spoke. I thought you'd never push back. The sentence landed quietly in the room. Because it was honest. I know, I said. Daniel looked up. That's why I kept pushing. The room went silent again. That was the realization shift. Not dramatic, just precise. Finally, Daniel leaned forward and folded the papers carefully. All right. Laura looked at him. All right, what? We accept the agreement. She blinked. You're sure? He nodded slowly. Yeah. He looked at me. I'll start looking for a job tomorrow. And the payments? I'll make them. Laura exhaled with visible relief. That was the procedural compliance moment. But Daniel wasn't finished. He looked around the living room slowly. The furniture, the framed photos, the familiar walls. You're taking the master bedroom back too? Yes, he nodded once. Fair. Laura squeezed his hand. Thank you. Daniel shrugged. I'm not doing it for gratitude. For what then? He looked at me. For structure. That surprised me slightly. Because he had finally used the same word. I nodded. That's all I ever wanted. The room relaxed a little after that. Not happily, but steadily. Daniel stood up. I'm going out for a bit. Laura looked concerned. Where? To think. He paused near the door, then turned back toward me. You know something? What? Daniel looked directly at me. Authority doesn't come from saying something first. He tapped the documents on the table. It comes from having the paperwork. That line stayed with me for a long time, because it was true. He left the house a moment later. Laura and I sat quietly in the living room for a while. Finally, she spoke. Mum, do you think we can fix this? I thought about the last 5 years, then about the last 2 days. I think structure gives people a chance. She nodded slowly. Then maybe we'll take it. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet again, I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea. The house felt different. Not hostile, just reorganized, like furniture that had finally been moved into its proper place. And for the first time in years, I realized something simple. Silence isn't the same as peace. Sometimes peace only arrives after structure. Monday morning arrived with a kind of quiet clarity I hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not dread. Just a steady sense that something had finally settled into its proper place. I woke a little before 6. The house was still. The kind of stillness that follows a difficult conversation when everyone is quietly adjusting to a new reality. I made coffee and opened the back door, letting the cool October air drift into the kitchen. The lemon tree Thomas planted years ago stood near the fence, its leaves turning pale yellow as the season changed. For a moment I stood there, remembering another morning. A small memory surfaced. It was the year before Thomas died, early spring. The grass was still damp from the night rain. He was kneeling in the yard with a small shovel, planting that lemon tree beside the fence. You know these barely survive Ohio winters, I told him. He shrugged, brushing dirt from his hands. Then we'll protect it. I handed him the watering can. You're stubborn, he smiled. Someone in this house has to plan ahead. The memory lingered for a moment before fading. Footsteps overhead brought me back. Daniel came downstairs first. He looked tired, but composed. Not the restless agitation from 2 nights earlier. This was the quieter exhaustion that follows long thinking. Morning, he said. Morning. He poured coffee and sat across from me. I called the bank again. Oh? They confirmed the restructuring terms. And they'll work with me if I start making payments. I nodded. That's how banks operate. Daniel studied me for a moment. You knew that? Yes. Laura came downstairs a few minutes later, tying her hair into a loose knot. The kids followed behind her, still half asleep and quiet. The room was calmer than usual, not cheerful, but settled. Laura sat down and glanced between Daniel and me. Did you two already start talking? Just logistics, Daniel said. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table. A folded sheet of paper. What's that? Laura asked. My employment confirmation. She blinked. You already got a job? Temporary position at an auto parts distributor. How did you? I went out Friday night. He shrugged slightly. I figured complaining wasn't going to fix anything. That was the final shift in the financial lane. Income, payment capacity, structure. Laura let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. That's good. Daniel nodded. It's not glamorous, but it's work. Then he looked at me. I'll start the first payment this week. That's acceptable. The kids were watching quietly now. Mason finally spoke. Are we moving? Laura looked at him carefully. Not right away. For 6 months, Daniel added. Claire tilted her head. Why 6 months? Daniel paused. Then he answered honestly. Because I made some bad decisions. The room went still again, but this time the quiet felt different. Claire nodded slowly. Okay. Children often accept the truth more easily than adults. Later that morning, Daniel and Laura drove downtown to Richard's office to sign the formal agreement. I didn't go with them. That surprised Daniel when I told him. You're not coming? No. Why not? Because the paperwork already says what it needs to say, and that was the truth. Procedure had already done its work. Around noon, Richard called. All signed, he said. Everything? Yes. And the payment schedule? Filed. I thanked him and hung up. That was the final institutional confirmation. The system had closed the loop. The afternoon passed quietly. I spent most of it moving my things back into the master bedroom. Laura helped without saying much. She carried the quilt Thomas's sister had made years ago and spread it across the bed the way I used to. At one point she paused and looked around the room. I forgot how big this room feels. It always was. She hesitated. Mum, I should have noticed sooner. I shook my head. People notice things when structure forces them to. She nodded slowly. That evening we ate dinner together again. Nothing elaborate, just soup and bread. But Daniel waited until everyone was served before starting his bowl. A small gestures. But small gestures are how new patterns begin. After dinner, I washed my cup and stood by the kitchen window for a moment. The neighborhood lights were coming on one by one along the street. Mrs. Alvarez was watering her plants again. Ordinary things, stable things. Daniel walked into the kitchen then and cleared his throat slightly. I wanted to say something. I turned toward him. Go ahead, he shifted awkwardly. I know the agreement says 6 months. Yes, but if I find a place sooner, that's fine. He nodded. Then he added quietly, and I'm sorry about the dinner. I studied his face for a moment, not searching for perfection, just sincerity. I believe you. He exhaled slowly. Thank you. He left the kitchen and went upstairs. I stayed by the window a little longer. The neighborhood had grown quiet now, porch lights glowing softly along the street. And I realized something simple. Some people mistake silence for permission. But structure has a way of correcting that mistake. Because in the end, respect rarely returns through arguments. It returns through boundaries. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. Sometimes the most powerful changes in a family don't arrive with shouting. They arrive with paperwork and the calm decision to finally sign your name.